What if I told you that the very evidence Blake Lively thought would save her case might actually destroy it? A secret audio recording, once hailed as proof, is now under fire. And the contradictions in her courtroom strategy are piling up fast. Hollywood is watching. The public is questioning, and the judge is closing in. Tonight, we're breaking down how Blake's entire legal battle may be collapsing in real time. Blake Lively's legal saga has taken yet another shocking twist, and this time it is not just about questionable strategies or shifting allegations. It is about something far more explosive and deeply ironic, because the very thing her legal team tried to accuse others of doing is now being exposed as something they themselves have apparently engaged in. And the fallout from this revelation could be devastating for her case and her credibility from the very beginning of this high-profile battle. We have seen shifting timelines, altered claims, and an ever-growing pile of contradictions. But nothing could prepare the public for the jaw-dropping irony that unfolded in court documents this week. It began when Blake Lively's lawyers moved aggressively against a content creator accusing him of illegally recording a phone call, trying to frame it as a criminal act and using that accusation to paint themselves as victims. But now, the tide has turned in spectacular fashion, because evidence has emerged showing that Blake Lively herself has been relying on audio recordings made without the consent of the person on the other end, and then cherry-picking snippets from those recordings to bolster her arguments and filings. The sheer audacity of this move cannot be overstated. It is as if her team never considered that the double standard would be exposed, because in one breath, they accused others of misconduct, and in the next, they quietly relied on similar tactics themselves. This revelation came to light when Wayfarer, one of the central defendants in this case, demanded that the court unseal an audio recording of Steve Sowitz, which Lively had selectively quoted from in her legal briefs. She presented fragments of the recording attempting to cast Sowitz in a damaging light. But crucially, Sowitz had never consented to being recorded, and now he and his legal team are calling for the entire unedited audio to be released. So the full context can be heard. This moment is nothing short of explosive, because it raises a fundamental question: if Blake Lively was willing to use snippets of an unauthorized recording to bolster her claims, what else has been cherry-picked, altered, or taken out of context across this entire legal war? The court filings are clear. Lively not only quoted from the audio, but also attempted to have the full recording sealed to prevent the public and the media from hearing it in its entirety, and her reasoning for sealing it was equally telling. She argued that releasing the full tape would invite negative publicity that could damage her reputation. But the judge and opposing counsel swiftly pointed out that reputational concerns are not a valid legal justification for hiding evidence, especially when she herself was the one who introduced portions of it into the public record. The hypocrisy here is staggering, because for months, Lively has presented herself as the one being targeted unfairly by others as the victim of smear campaigns. And yet here she is allegedly engaging in tactics that raise serious ethical and potentially legal questions. The reaction from Steve Sowitz's side was immediate and powerful. They argued that if she is going to quote from the audio, then the full unedited recording must be released for transparency and fairness, because without the full context, the public is left with a distorted version of events that only serves Lively's narrative. And this is where the suspense deepens, because if the full audio is released and it shows that her selective quoting painted an inaccurate picture, her credibility could collapse in an instant. And so we now find ourselves staring at a pivotal moment. In this case, the kind of turning point that could unravel everything she has built up until now. Because if the foundation of her claims rests on distorted fragments of secretly recorded conversations, then how much weight can any of her arguments truly carry? It is not just about one tape. It is about a pattern of shifting allegations, cherry-picked details, and narrative control. And the question every observer is asking now is simple: what happens when the mask slips and the truth comes pouring out? The irony is thick, the drama is undeniable, and the suspense only grows as more people realize that the very accusations she hurled at others may now come back to haunt her in the most public way possible. As the courtroom drama escalates with the audio revelation, another thread begins to unravel, and this one is just as dramatic, because now we turn to Blake Lively's retaliation claims, which have always been at the center of her case and yet have always felt unstable, shifting, and difficult to pin down. And the recent filings only reinforce the sense that her legal team is struggling to construct a consistent narrative from the very start. She alleged that Wayfarer and its executives engaged in a retaliatory smear campaign designed to harm her. But what is striking is how the timeline for this supposed retaliation keeps changing as though it is being retrofitted to survive legal scrutiny. The most recent joint letter submitted to the court reveals that Lively is now claiming the smear campaign began during the actual filming and promotion of It Ends With Us, and that it continues to this day. This is a dramatic change from earlier filings where she suggested the retaliation only began months after filming had wrapped. And this matters because in legal terms, timing is everything. Retaliation claims need to show a clear causal link between a protected activity and the alleged retaliatory response. Courts look at whether retaliation happened quickly enough to suggest cause and effect. So when there is an unexplained gap of 8 months or more between the two, it creates a massive hole in the argument. And that is exactly what critics have been pointing out in her case for months. So now her team appears to be shifting the timeline backward, pulling the start date of the smear campaign into early 2024 to close that gap and try to make the retaliation argument more plausible. But here is where the suspense intensifies, because Lively herself previously admitted that the second round of filming went smoothly, with no harassment, no problems, and no conflicts. She even used that admission as part of her earlier filings to bolster her credibility. So how then can she now argue that retaliation began during the filming, if she already told the court the opposite? It is a glaring contradiction and one that could haunt her as the case moves closer to summary judgment. What this really reveals is a strategy that looks less like a confident claim based on facts and more like a desperate attempt to move the goalposts whenever the current story no longer fits. The legal framework needed to survive the judge's scrutiny, and the longer this goes on, the more obvious it becomes that the foundation of her retaliation case is fragile, built on shifting sand rather than solid ground. The filings show how her team cites a January 4th meeting and earlier email lists as the alleged protected activities that supposedly triggered retaliation. But even if you take the latest date, January 2024, the timeline still leaves an unexplained gap of 8 months before the retaliation allegedly began. That is the legal equivalent of a chasm one so wide that even the most skilled lawyer would struggle to bridge it, unless of course they simply redraw the timeline, which is what seems to be happening here. The suspense is breathtaking, because if this strategy backfires, it could expose the entire case as an elaborate construction, with moving parts designed to create the illusion of retaliation, where none actually existed. And that is not just a small problem, it is potentially fatal to her claims. The public reaction has been one of mounting skepticism, with many now openly questioning whether any of these allegations hold water, or whether they are simply shifting stories designed to keep the case alive for as long as possible. And that skepticism grows every time a new contradiction surfaces, because credibility once lost is nearly impossible to regain. And when you add the secret audio controversy on top of these shifting timelines, it begins to look less like a strong case and more like a story collapsing under its own weight. It is the kind of unraveling that keeps audiences glued to every update, because no one knows which revelation will drop next, or how much more fragile the narrative can get before it crumbles completely. And that is the true suspense of this unfolding saga. Because every filing, every letter, every court order now feels like a potential bombshell waiting to go off. The deeper we go into this case, the more the contradictions multiply. And nowhere is that clearer than in the way Blake Lively and her team have chosen to frame themselves as both victims and aggressors at the same time. On the one hand, they accuse others of conducting smear campaigns, manipulating narratives, and spreading harmful stories. Yet on the other hand, they themselves have been caught controlling the narrative by withholding context, cherry-picking fragments, and leaning on incomplete accounts to shape perception, and this duality is beginning to catch up with them, because each revelation exposes not just inconsistency, but also intent and motive. When we return to the contested audio of Steve Sowitz, we find a perfect example of this pattern. Lively quotes the parts that suit her, but fights to hide the rest, arguing that the full story would hurt her reputation. And while she claims victimhood in the public square, the filings reveal an entirely different picture. One in which she and her team are willing to bend the rules of transparency to maintain control over how the story is told. This is not a minor detail. It is the very heart of the case, because credibility is everything. And once it is called into question, every subsequent claim is viewed through a lens of doubt. Imagine for a moment, what happens if the judge rules to unseal the full Sowitz audio, and the public hears the entire conversation? Imagine the shock if the carefully selected fragments, Lively relied upon, turn out to be misleading. Imagine the fallout when the narrative she worked so hard to build collapses in real time under the weight of its own omissions. The suspense lies not just in what is on that tape, but in what it symbolizes. Because if one piece of evidence can be shown to be incomplete or manipulated, then how many other parts of her filings are vulnerable to the same critique? And that is why Wayfarer and its allies are pushing so hard to bring everything into the open. They know that context is their strongest weapon, and they also know that Lively's team cannot control context. Once it is fully revealed, this connects directly to the retaliation timeline, because both issues are about selective storytelling. And both expose the same underlying weakness, a narrative that shifts too easily, a story that bends too much under scrutiny, and a set of claims that feel less like solid allegations, and more like a puzzle assembled after the fact. The danger for Lively is that courts are not swayed by shifting stories, they demand consistency. And when a plaintiff changes the core of their allegations to fit the legal calendar, it sends a clear signal of desperation. The irony, of course, is that by trying so hard to control perception, she may have ensured the opposite outcome, because every attempt to shift the timeline or withhold context only fuels further doubt in the eyes of the court and the public. And once doubt becomes the dominant theme, it is nearly impossible to reverse that perception. The suspense continues to build because we are approaching a moment where the judge will need to rule on whether the audio remains sealed, whether the retaliation claims survive, and whether this case even has enough weight to move forward. And in that moment, we will see whether all of the dramatic pivots, contradictions, and secrecy have helped her or doomed her. But one thing is already certain: every twist, every contradiction, every hidden piece of evidence has made this case less about the alleged wrongs she suffered and more about the choices she and her team made to fight it. And that may be the greatest twist of all, because in trying to expose others, she may have exposed herself. And in trying to control the narrative, she may have lost it entirely. And that is the suspense that keeps us all waiting for the next revelation. Because if the past is any guide, the next twist will be even more shocking than the last. What makes this saga even more gripping is not just the legal maneuvers themselves, but the larger implications for everyone watching. Because when you strip away the filings, the exhibits, and the cross-allegations, what you are left with is a portrait of a celebrity legal battle that has spiraled so far beyond its original scope that it now feels like a drama about power control and reputation rather than justice. At the center of this storm is Blake Lively, who has presented herself as someone wronged, seeking accountability, but who now faces mounting questions about her own tactics. And the more her team tries to recalibrate the story, the more it looks like the narrative is slipping out of their hands. Take the retaliation timeline, for example. Once a key weapon in her legal arsenal, it has now become a spotlight on inconsistency. First, it was months after filming. Then it was suddenly during filming, despite earlier claims that Phase 2 of production was smooth and problem-free. And these changes are not subtle. They are fundamental shifts that call into question the very core of her allegations. Because if the story of when retaliation began can change so dramatically, then what else is subject to change? What else is malleable? What else might be revised? The suspense comes from knowing that these contradictions will not remain abstract forever. They will be confronted in court under oath, where lawyers will press for explanations and where a judge will have little patience. For inconsistencies, it is in those high-stakes moments that the truth will be tested, and it is difficult to see how a shifting timeline will survive rigorous cross-examination. But even more than the timeline, even more than the audio tape, the true suspense of this case lies in the reputational fallout. Because win or lose in court, the perception that Lively's team bent the truth, shifted stories, and withheld context will linger long after the final ruling, and that perception is already spreading across the public sphere with each new revelation, each new contradiction, each new attempt to move the goalposts. What began as a legal battle over alleged mistreatment has now become a story about credibility, trust, and authenticity, and those are qualities that once lost cannot easily be regained. The irony is that in fighting so hard to protect her reputation, she may have inflicted more damage on it than any alleged smear campaign ever could, because nothing undermines public trust faster than the sense that a story keeps changing. Nothing erodes confidence more quickly than evidence of selective disclosure, and nothing feels more dramatic than watching a case collapse. Not because of the actions of others, but because of the contradictions of the person who brought it. This is why the suspense feels unbearable at times, because we are all waiting to see whether the judge forces the release of the full Sowitz recording, whether the retaliation claims survive summary, judgment, and whether the story Lively has told can withstand the glare of full transparency, the outcome remains uncertain. But what is already clear is that this case has revealed far more about her strategies than perhaps she ever intended, and the more we learn, the more fragile her position appears. It is like watching a tower built of cards where each contradiction, each revelation, each hidden piece of evidence is a gust of wind, and sooner or later, that tower will fall. The only question left is when and how hard the collapse will be. And that uncertainty, that looming sense of inevitable unraveling, is what keeps this case so captivating and so dramatic. Because we are not just watching a lawsuit, we are watching the slow unmasking of a narrative that can no longer hold its shape, and the suspense of that is impossible to ignore. The conclusion to this unfolding legal drama is not simply about one audio tape or one shifting timeline. It is about the larger story that has now taken shape, a story that began with bold accusations and confident claims, but has slowly revealed cracks, contradictions, and strategies that feel increasingly unstable. When Blake Lively and her legal team accused others of misconduct, they may not have expected that spotlight to turn back on them. Yet here we are with revelations about recordings made without consent, about attempts to control what evidence is seen and what is hidden, and about retaliation, claims that seem to change, depending on what the legal strategy of the moment demands. It has become a drama less about what actually happened on set or in meetings, and more about whether the narrative built to describe those events can survive the intense scrutiny of a courtroom and the even harsher judgment of public opinion. The suspense is now centered on what comes next. Will the judge order the release of the full Sowitz recording? Will the retaliation claims survive long enough to reach trial? Or will the contradictions prove fatal to the entire case? One thing is certain. The longer this drags on, the more the public will question not just the claims, but the credibility of the person making them. And in a world where perception matters as much as verdicts, that could be the most damaging blow of all. In the end, this story may not be remembered for what was alleged, but for how it unraveled, for how each revelation exposed not just the weaknesses of a case, but the dangers of trying to control a narrative that refuses to stay contained. And that is the final irony, because in seeking to define the story, Blake Lively may have lost control of it entirely.